Welcome to the EBP OT podcast with your host, Kim Griffin. Welcome to the EBP OT podcast, where I help you stay up to date with current research in paediatric OT. My name is Kim Griffin. I'm a paediatric OT and your host. This week, I'm looking at two systematic reviews, one which includes a meta-analysis. Just in case you don't know, a systematic review is a structured analysis of the literature which includes all published literature meeting the author's inclusion criteria, which is critically evaluated. The goal is to provide a concise, evidence-based summary of the current knowledge on a specific topic. In situations where there is enough data available, the authors also complete what is called a meta-analysis. This is where they combine all of the data from the studies and perform statistical analysis, which summarizes the results from multiple studies to obtain a pooled or summary estimate of the impact of interventions. Both of the studies I'm reviewing today only included research that used a randomized controlled trial methodology. This is where the studies have an intervention and a control group, and participants are randomly allocated into these groups. So they did not include published works which used different methodological approaches, such as case studies or pre- and post-interventions with a single group. The first article explores the effect of motor interventions on cognition, communication, and social interactions of autistic children. The second explores the use of air sensory integration treatment, and this study also has a strong focus on autism, as the majority of studies located were studying autistic populations. If you'd like to receive the links to the articles and the show notes, you can join the EBP OT mailing list at ebpot.com. The link is in the show notes below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. This lets me know that you're interested and you want to learn more. So let's jump straight into the first study. The article is called A Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis of the Effect of Motor Intervention on Cognition, Communication, and Social Interactions in Children with Autistic Spectrum Disorder. It was published online in Physical and Occupational Therapy in Pediatrics in May 2025, and the paper was written by Rosales and colleagues. Just a note on language, I have moved a lot of the content into identity first language, but throughout some of the papers, I will use the terminology that the authors have used. For example, in the title of the paper, I can't change that to identity first language because that is not the actual title of the paper. So where I can, I will prioritize identity first language, but there are times where, to stay true to the publication, I will stick with the terminology that has been used, as I don't want to alter the meaning of results, or I don't want to give you the incorrect title of a specific article. So, for this study, the authors start by defining that whilst autistic children are primarily diagnosed based on social communication difficulties and restricted repetitive behaviours, up to 86.9% also experience motor impairments. These motor difficulties affect postural control, coordination, imitation, and motor planning, and the authors argue that motor skills are intertwined with social communication and cognitive development. So they set out to systematically examine whether motor interventions could improve not just motor skills, but also social communication and cognitive outcomes in autistic children and young people aged 0 to 21 years. The team followed the rigorous systematic review guidelines using the PRISMA framework. PRISMA is the gold standard approach to conducting systematic reviews. I've included a link to the website in the show notes if you want to learn more. The search period covered January 2000 to May 2004. To be included, the research had to be a randomized control trial published after the year 2000, include autistic participants aged 0 to 21 years with autism, use a motor intervention which explicitly targeted motor skill acquisition, and also measured social communication or cognitive outcomes. They excluded studies where more than 30% of the participants were born preterm or had intellectual disability with an IQ below 70. The systematic review process identified 23 eligible randomized controlled trials. 5 of these had high risk of bias in 2 or more areas when critically reviewed, but the overall risk of bias in the studies was low for about 70% of the measures. The main area with high risk of bias in the studies was blinding and group allocation concealment. And I think this is incredibly difficult to achieve in physical intervention studies. So blinding is where the person engaged in the intervention doesn't know whether they're engaged in the intervention or not. So unlike medicines, where you can give every participant a tablet and conceal whether the tablet is a placebo or the drug, it can be very difficult to hide physical therapy interventions like horse riding or dance from the participants. So whilst controlling for bias is incredibly important and blinding and group allocation concealment does add a rigor to the study, it can be incredibly difficult to do in our occupational therapy and physical therapy interventions because sometimes the intervention is incredibly obvious. So like if you're in the horse riding group or not in the horse riding group, it's very difficult to conceal that from participants. The mean age across the studies ranged from 4.3 to 12.3 years, but no studies included children under the age of 4. The interventions varied considerably across the different studies, but several clear categories emerged. The most common was general aerobic exercise, which included fundamental motor skills training, physical activity programs, and cooperative movement games. This category represented about 43.5% of the studies. Therapeutic horse riding was the second most common intervention at 21.7%. This was followed by martial arts, specifically Neiyang at 17% of the studies. The other interventions included virtual fitness, yoga, and musical therapies. And listening to this list, you'll be able to understand why it was so hard to blind the control group that wasn't receiving things like horse riding and the treatment group that was receiving things like horse riding and martial arts. Interventions were delivered by various professionals, including physical educators, expert sports coaches, riding instructors, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and clinical psychologists. The control groups typically received either standard care, waitlist control, or alternative activities like tabletop games or barn activities without horse riding. So, what were the results? 15 of the studies had sufficient data, so the means and the standard deviations, for the researchers to include in the meta-analysis. So this is when they take all of the data and combine it to understand the impact that the interventions are having. And this impact is measured by something called an effect size. In this particular study, the effect size was measured using a statistical test called Hedges-G. The meta-analysis revealed that the motor interventions had a small to medium positive effect size, which was statistically significant when all domain outcomes were combined. The outcomes of motor interventions on the social and social communication domains were the most significant, with both showing statistically significant small to medium positive effect sizes. The cognitive domain did not reach statistical significance, and there was insufficient data for the researchers to analyse the communication domain. Interestingly, although the studies were exploring motor-based interventions, the effect size for the motor domain alone was not statistically significant. The researchers acknowledged this finding should be interpreted cautiously, as many of the studies used motor measures only at baseline rather than as outcome measures. Also, they excluded motor intervention studies if they didn't measure social communication or cognitive outcomes as well. This means they've likely excluded a large number of motor intervention studies which only reported on motor skill outcomes. I was reflecting that this might also be linked to the outcome measures that they were using for motor skills, which was typically the Brunics or the movement ABC. And as OTs, we know that these tests measure discrete, isolated skills, so balancing on one foot, catching a ball with one hand, threading, things like that. However, many of the interventions targeted participatory gross motor skills, like dancing, horse riding, and martial arts, rather than the discrete skills on the assessment tools. From an OT perspective, these assessments may not have been the best outcome measures to assess the functional motor skill improvements. So, did the child participate in their dance recital, or can they now independently ride a horse, or did they pass their martial arts grading? So the movement tests aren't necessarily going to measure the improvements in those functional skills, and that activities like dancing and horse riding aren't necessarily going to make a difference to how quickly the child can complete some of those discrete skills like pegboards and threading. Age emerged as a potential moderator. The initial analysis suggested that for children above the age of 9, each additional year of age corresponded to a 0.9 decrease in standardized mean between the intervention and the control groups, indicating that interventions may be less effective for older children. However, the more structured statistical analysis, called regression analysis, didn't reach statistical significance, so the authors concluded that age was not a significant factor. So, what's the takeaway for occupational therapists working with autistic school-aged children? For me, the most interesting thing was that the meta-analysis indicated that the motor interventions did have a positive effect on the children's overall results, and the impact on the social and communication domains were the most statistically significant. Therefore, these motor interventions, such as martial arts, dance, and horse riding, can be considered a viable approach for addressing some of the social communication difficulties and not just the motor skill impairments that these children might have. And I think as OTs, we are always looking for participation and engagement. So it's great to see the wider impacts that these physical activities can have on autistic children's overall outcomes. And it's a piece of information you can give to parents and teachers as well who are thinking about what activities might be helpful for their autistic children. And you can sort of give a vote for the motor skill activities, particularly things like dance, martial arts, horse riding, as they've been showing to help with all areas of development, not just motor skills. We're going to the American Occupational Therapy Journal May edition, and the authors are Acuna and colleagues. The article's titled AS Sensory Integration with Children Aged 0 to 12, a Systematic Review of Randomized Controlled Trials. The aim of the review was to explore if, when AS sensory integration follows fidelity, does it lead to positive outcomes for children? The authors searched all main medical databases up until June 2024. They only included peer-reviewed studies where intervention sessions followed the AS sensory integration fidelity measure. If you're not familiar with this measure, it was published in 2007. I have included the link to the article in the show notes. The measure includes the structural and process elements that evaluate whether the intervention was AS sensory integration or not. Structural elements include things like the therapist qualifications, the type of equipment, and process elements include things like whether the session was child-led and if there's evidence of the just right challenge. The measure was developed to help separate interventions that may use sensory integration theory but that are not actually AS sensory integration. For example, it would separate out brushing protocols or sensory diets or weighted vest or sensory exercise interventions as not being AS sensory integration. And it helps to identify what therapy sessions would qualify as AS sensory integration in the way that AS described sensory integration treatment. This is really important because many studies say that they are using sensory integration treatment, but they're not actually using AS sensory integration in the way that AS described the treatment. Following the article screening, 9 randomized controlled trials met the inclusion criteria for the systematic review. These 9 studies included 344 children, and they came from multiple countries, including Australia, Brazil, Iran, Turkey, South Africa, and the United States. The ASI intervention sessions for all of these studies were performed by OTs. The dosage, or the amount of intervention, ranged from 1 to 3 sessions over 10 to 12-week periods. The studies measured a variety of outcomes, including individualized goals, behavior outcomes, functional skills, carer stress, and quality of life. And the control groups received differing interventions, including usual care, routine school-based OT, sensory motor activities, and fine motor activities. Because majority of the studies focused on using air-center integration with autistic populations, the authors break the results into using air-center integration with autistic children and using it with other populations. So we'll have a look at the results for autistic children first. So 6 of the 9 studies focused on using air-center integration with autistic children, and this was mostly boys aged between 3.9 and 12 years. These results include the SANITA trial, which was completed in the UK. I've included the link to this trial in the show notes. Just over half of the children they're referring to were from the SANITA trial, so 138 of the children in these results were from the SANITA trial, and 124 were from the 5 other studies. The conclusions they found from reviewing these 6 studies are: air-sensory integration can help autistic children to achieve their individualized goals. This finding is based on 4 studies. The functional goals included self-care skills, communication, school participation, play skills, and motor coordination. The authors describe the evidence here as strong, and it's unlikely to be challenged by future research. Although they mention it in the discussion section, I don't think the authors critically evaluate the fact that the SANITA trial did not assign goals to the control group. So the outcomes related to goals in the SANITA study are for the treatment group only. This makes it more similar to a pre-post study design with a single group rather than a randomized control trial where statistical analysis can be performed on the results of both groups. Unfortunately, this is a significant limitation of the SANITA trial, which has already been discussed by others. So we need to be mindful that that conclusion is not completely based on randomized controlled trial data as one might initially perceive it to be, because half of the results, there was no comparison to the control group on the individualized goals. The next thing the authors found is that the evidence suggests that air-sensory integration does not change what they term behaviors of concern, such as non-compliance, irritability, resistance to change, and hyperactivity. This is often an area that is explored in autism research, particularly historically. I do think that will probably change in the future as we move to more strength-based approaches, but we're obviously looking at research that was done over many years. So there is that piece around behaviors of concern and that language within the articles. So these results came from 3 studies, and the authors concluded that there is moderate evidence that air-center integration just isn't the right intervention to impact behavioral issues. This was the primary outcome measure on the SANITA trial, and the behavior measures were completed with both the intervention and control groups, and they did conclude that air-center integration did not make changes with the behaviors of concern. There were mixed results on outcomes looking at functional and developmental skills, with some studies finding improvements in things like sensory processing and self-care skills, but others finding they didn't change. So the authors concluded that there is low evidence to support these changes in functional and developmental skills as measured on standardized assessments. 3 of the other studies looked at different diagnostic groups. These included sensory modulation disorders, premature infants, and children with cerebral palsy. Whilst there were some positive outcomes reported for these groups, there just wasn't enough research to draw strong conclusions for these populations. So, what are our practical applications? Firstly, when air-sensory integration was effective, the sessions were occurring 2 to 3 times a week over 10 to 12 weeks, and they were typically 45 to 60 minutes long. This dosage is very intensive, and I'm not sure how frequently it is occurring outside of private clinics in the USA. Therefore, as OTs, if we're thinking about using air-sensory integration with fidelity, we need to keep this high dosage in mind when recommending it to parents and organising our intervention timetables. The evidence is also telling us that we shouldn't reach for air-sensory integration when the main concern is challenging behaviours. This could be, in my experience, because many of the behaviours we see in autistic children are often triggered by environmental sensations or sensory overload. For me, our role here is to advocate for environmental changes, consistent routines, and low arousal approaches in order to accommodate and support these children's needs, rather than necessarily expecting them to change. The other finding is that individualized functional goals can be achieved with air sensory integration. I would caveat this by saying that none of the studies compared air sensory integration against top-down functional approaches to see whether the same results could be achieved with potentially less resource-intensive lower dosage approaches. Most of the comparisons were with motor skills groups or usual care. In the Sonita trial, usual care was often very limited input from therapists, as these children were receiving usual care from the National Health Service in the UK. There are more details on this in the full report. In the studies where the control group received direct therapy input, improvements were usually seen with gas or Copland goals, although these were statistically lower than the groups receiving air sensory integration. It doesn't mean that the children weren't achieving their goals. So we do have evidence that air sensory integration can help children with functional goals if delivered at high intensity, but not whether this is the most time or cost-effective approach to supporting our children to receive these goals. As I said in the introductory episode, my aim with this podcast is to make published works more accessible and to open a dialogue. I appreciate that we have ongoing conversations within our community with regards to impact of different approaches, and I think that it is important that we are staying aware of the available evidence and implementing best practices. As our evidence base continues to evolve, we can expect to gain clearer insights into which children benefit the most from different intervention approaches and under what circumstances, ultimately helping us to provide the most effective interventions for our children. Thanks so much for listening today. You are among my first listeners, and I'm really excited to have you here. In case you didn't listen to the introductory episode, my goal is to reach 2,000 listeners by the end of April 2026. If you are listening, please let me know by subscribing to the podcast in your podcast app. You can also receive notifications of new episodes and the links to the show notes by joining my mailing list at ebpot.com, essentially evidence-based-practice-ot.com, so ebpot.com. The website also includes information on the live, obviously online journal clubs. The next one will be on the 27th of January, and I'd love to see you there. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to share this podcast with another pediatric OT. I'll see you in 2 weeks. The articles I'm discussing explore the minimally important change on the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure. So they're discussing whether the 2-point improvement that we have considered a significant improvement in scores and whether this is actually clinically significant or not. I'll see you then. This podcast provides educational commentary and analysis of recent research for continuing professional development. All studies are properly cited and used under the fair use provisions for educational purposes. Listeners should consult the original sources for complete study details.